So welcome everyone who's joining me today. This presentation is going to take about 45 to 50 minutes. And at the end of it, we'll have a question and answer session. Owing to a misspent youth, my hearing's not great. So I'm going to ask you, if you do want to ask a question, to make sure to talk loudly. So on the 14th of April, 1917, two battalions of the 29th Battalion struck east from Monchy-le-Preux, one of which was the Newfoundland Regiment, memorialized by this caribou sitting in the village. These two battalions hit the 3rd Bavarian Division, which, employing the new German flexible defense and depth tactics, fell back in front of the attackers, slowed them down, stopped them, and then counterattacked and annihilated these two battalions. 16 months later, two Canadian battalions were in almost exactly the same position. They too advanced east from Monchy-le-Preux, were slowed and then stopped, and then faced a 4-battalion German counterattack. Except this time, the Germans were stopped before they even reached the Canadian line. Clearly, something had changed in the ability for the Germans to launch these powerful counterattacks. So the purpose of this presentation is to examine this phenomena through the lens of looking at 5 case studies focused on the Second Battle of Arras, running from the 26th of August to the 3rd of September, 1918. And how I'm going to go about doing this is take a look at first reviewing what was the German doctrine, so that we have a common understanding of what we're looking at. Then we'll take a look at Second Arras. I'm going to give a quick overview of the battle, as well as put this case studies that I talked about into context. Then we're going to look at 5 case studies, the 2 that I mentioned in my preamble, one on the 30th of August and 2 on 1st of September, 1918. In each case, these are based on German, British, and Canadian records, so that we can get a 360-degree view of what was occurring. And the idea being that I'll provide you with the context, the combatants, what was the combat outcome, and then highlight one or more of the factors that contribute to either the success or failure of this counterattack. And then I'm going to conclude by looking at what were the factors overall that contributed to a far less set of counterattacks at Second Arras than was the case previously. So let's start with the doctrine. Now, just as a matter of interest, that officer you see striding purposefully to your left of the Kaiser is General Major von Chemnitz, commander of the 35th Division, and he will show up in our story. Over the winter of 1916-1917, the German High Command codified the doctrinal changes that had been implemented in the later stages of the Somme and at Verdun, of a flexible defense in depth, with the idea of slowing the enemy down, stopping them, and then launching stinging counterattacks to drive the enemy back. And conceptually, the way I like to look at it as an analogy, think of the attackers as running into the ocean. At first, the water is shallow, the going is easy, but as the water gets deeper and the waves start hitting more often, it becomes more and more difficult. They're exhausted, they're tired. Eventually, they pass a point of equilibrium, at which point a wave strikes them, throws them off their feet, and throws them back onto the beach. So again, the whole concept of this is slow, stop, and then throw the enemy back. Now, how did this work on the ground? Well, it was by positioning machine gun posts, here represented by those blue dots, in depth, mutually supporting, such that they could bring enfilade or flanking fire on the attacking infantry. The Germans had discovered that this was by far the most effective way of inflicting casualties, disorganization, and having outsized morale effects. The second pillar was, while the attackers are advancing, there are pre-planned artillery barrages brought in typically by rocket signals on the exposed troops. Now, the expectation is that the Allied attack is going to gain some ground. They'll have reached a point where they've been finally slowed and stopped. And this is the point at which the counterattack will hit them and throw them back. The idea being, this is the point at which the attackers are their weakest. They've suffered casualties, disorganization, they're low on ammo, they are tired, they're exhausted physically and psychologically, and it takes superb leadership to motivate troops to consolidate to prepare for a counterattack. That's the point at which German forces, either local reserves or specially positioned reserves, will strike and throw back the enemy. Now, on the ground, how the Germans deployed was typically a frontline division. In this case, the 214th Division is deployed on a front of 3 regiments, with 1 battalion forward, 1 battalion in the main battle zone, and 1 in reserve. The Germans would divide their defenses into 3 zones. There is the forward zone, or Vorfeld. It is ideally deep enough that it prevents the field artillery barrage from reaching the main battle zone. So it's going to be between 2,000 and 3,000 yards deep. It is lightly manned by the Arras. The Germans are deploying only 2 companies in this zone from a battalion to try and slow the enemy down. The purpose is not to fight to the death in this sector, but to fall back in front of the advancing forces, inflicting casualties and exhaustion on the enemy. The main battle is in the battle zone. That's where the attackers are going to be stopped and where they're going to be set up for the counterattack. And it's at this point, the attackers have lost their field artillery barrage. They're having to rely on their own infantry weapons, whereas the defenders are in position. They have ammunition. They're prepared for this. This is where they're going to stop them. Behind the battle zone was a rear or artillery protection zone. This is where the artillery would be positioned, as well as reserves, out of range of the field artillery and able to be in position to counterattack. One of the changes that occurred in this particular battle is the Germans have started moving their field artillery further to the rear to get away from counter battery fire, as well as the risk of being captured by the infantry. But what that meant was that that forward zone was now out of reach for the field artillery. And the commander of the 2nd Bavarian Corps admitted after the battle that that was a mistake, because it removed one of the 3 main pillars for the German defensive doctrine. So reserves are positioned well in the rear. That's where they train and where they're ready to intervene. But further behind each one of these forward divisions, ideally was what was called an Eingreifdivision, or intervention division. It's specially trained in positions such that it can intervene promptly with prepared artillery barrages to drive back a major attack. For the Germans, unfortunately, on the 26th of August, the 2nd Bavarian Corps is not well provisioned. To the south of the Arras-Cambrai road is the 26th Reserve Division. While a crack formation, it has effectively only 1 regiment available. To the north, the 35th Division is deployed. That's von Chemnitz's unit. Is deployed on the wrong side of the scarp above this map. So they're not going to be able to intervene until the afternoon of the opening day of the battle. So I just want to do is just a quick overview of 2nd Arras, so we know where everything fits. In the aftermath of the Amiens offensive, the Canadian Corps moves back to the Vimy sector, while the 4th Army continues its offensive, and the 3rd Army joins in on the 21st of August. And while they are gaining ground and they're pushing the Germans back, the British commander, Field Marshal Haig, is concerned that the Germans are going to do what they did in March 1917 and fall back to the Hindenburg Line. To avoid this particular issue, he gives the Canadians their most important operational assignment of the war, more important than Vimy, Passchendaele, or Amiens. So on the 24th of August, they're given the mission. They are to strike southeast from Arras, centered on the Arras-Cambrai road, advance 27 kilometers and reach the outskirts of Cambrai. In doing so, they'll decisively outflank the Hindenburg Line, as well as knocking out the linchpin of German defenses on the Western Front. The Canadians have a formidable task in front of them. They're to advance centered on the Arras-Cambrai road, but they're going to face a 15-kilometer deep zone of defenses, some of the best on the Western Front. This sector had been fought over extensively since April 1917. The villages are smashed. The roads are in terrible state. Their entire area is seamed with trenches, barbed wire, and battlefield detritus. It's a attacker's nightmare and a defender's dream. and they have to go through 5 separate zones of defenses. There's the Aufushi-1 Corps line that was so important in First Arras. There's the British and German front lines after March 1918, the German and British front lines after First Arras, the Fresnes-Rouvroy line, the Drocourt-Queant line, which was built on the same principles as the Hindenburg line. And then as an added bonus, there is the Canal du Nord. In this sector, it's partially flooded. So the Canadians are going to have to seize crossing points. They will not be able to do an assault crossing of this sector. And just to make things even more challenging, to the south of the Canadian sector runs the Hindenburg line, which means the British Corps on the Canadian flank is going to have to hack its way through the Hindenburg line if it's going to keep up with the Canadians. These case studies that we're going to be looking at, the first 2 are centered around Monchy-le-Preux, and you see here outlined. The second is on the 30th of August, and it involves the capture of the southern portion of the Fresnes-Rouvroy line. And there are 2 more on the 1st of September, which is a series of counterattacks and battles for jump-off positions to attack the Drocourt-Queant line. So I want to just give you a quick outline of the battle. So the battle opens on the 26th of August with the 3rd and 2nd Canadian divisions advancing around 6,000 yards, taking over 1,000 prisoners. To the north is the 51st Highland Division, which served with the Canadians to the 29th of August. As they didn't face any really significant counterattacks, I am going to be focusing on the main part of the battlefield. The battle resumes again on the next day on the 27th of August, same 2 divisions. This time they have a much more difficult situation. They are unable to crack the Fresnes-Rouvroy line. Third day of the offensive, both divisions by now are very tired, have suffered a lot of casualties. The 2nd Division has no success. They are stock cold in front of their Fresnes-Rouvroy line. However, the 3rd Division adopts a different policy of narrow front sequential attacks that punches a series of holes in the line and allows them to outflank the main German defenses, forcing the 35th Division to tumble back across a nearby brook and out of harm's way. Ludendorff, the senior German commander, is extremely upset with the performance of the 35th Division, and our friend von Chemnitz is sacked as a result of this particular battle. By now, both Canadian divisions are pretty much exhausted. They need to be replaced. There's the days of, while the 4th British and 1st Canadian are moved into position. On the 30th of August, they resume the offensive. The 4th British captures some of the jump-off line for the attack on the DQ line, whereas the 1st Division is dealing with capturing the southern portion of the Fresnes-Rouvroy line and will be subject to a significant German counterattack. All during this stage of the battle, the German Corps commander, Konrad Krafft von Dellmensingen, is determined to keep the Canadians away from the DQ line. So he commits pretty much all of his reserves in constant counterattacks to drive the Canadians back. And in the process, he inflicts grave damage on his corps. 31st of August, the rest of the Fresnes-Rouvroy line is captured. Then on the 1st of September, the 4th Canadian Division has now entered the line, so the 3 divisions are able to get to the jump-off positions to attack the DQ line, which triggers a series of serious counterattacks on the front of the 1st and 4th Divisions. So at this point, the Canadians are ready to take on the Drocourt-Queant line. It's by reputation a very strong position. It turns out it's not quite as strong as was thought, but more importantly, the defenders have been burned out in making fruitless counterattacks. Canadians attack on the 2nd, along with the 4th British, and the DQ line falls with relative ease, quite surprisingly. However, when they try to advance beyond it, they are stock cold by a crack German formation, the 1st Guards Reserve Division. Without artillery support, the 4th British and 4th Canadian are unable to make any ground and suffer very heavy casualties. So by the end of the 2nd of September, the DQ line has fallen, but the Canadians are still a long ways from the Canal du Nord. The three divisions are tired and disorganized and find it very difficult to attack. As bad as the Canadian situation was, the Germans are even worse. 5 of the 6 divisions that they started the battle with are effectively destroyed. The one remaining, the 1st Guards Reserve Division, is in poor shape, and they've lost all of their fixed defenses other than a few small sectors. They have no choice but to have to fall back behind the Canal du Nord, which triggers a retreat on the fronts of the 3rd and 4th Army fronts as the Germans fall back. Canadians follow up, but it's clear by the end of the 3rd of September that the offensive has ended. All right, let's start with our first case study then. So this is a picture from 1919 from Monchy-le-Preux, and what it attests to is the absolutely phenomenal observation advantage it presents. And I think if anyone who's been there can attest to how much it dominates the surrounding ground. So on the 14th of April, the British have taken Monchy-le-Preux and have given the assignment to the 1st Essex and Newfoundland units to capture Infantry Hill and ideally Baudevert and Baudessart if possible. The defenders consist of the 3rd Barbarian Division, which is deployed in the, by now, classic 3-regiment formation, 1 battalion in each regiment forward, 1 in the main battle zone, and, excuse me here, and 1 in reserve. Attack goes in at 7:30 under a weak artillery barrage. The 2 battalions, without any flank support, not a very good plan by any means, are able to take Infantry Hill. But the Germans have fallen back and have prepared a counterattack, which comes crashing into the 2 regiments and effectively annihilates them. Very little information gets back to headquarters as to what happens. Why was this attack successful? Well, one is a poor British plan, excellent timing on the part of the Germans, but an important one and a theme that we're going to see over and over again is communications, that there was almost no information able to get back to the headquarters to bring in supporting artillery. So these 2 battalions were essentially left to their own devices to fend off the German counterattackers. So let's spring forward 16 months and take a look at what happens in 1918. This is another picture of Monchy-le-Preux, and again, you can see how much it dominates the surrounding ground. In this case, the Canadians have taken Monchy-le-Preux early in the morning of 26th of August. It's now the turn of the 7th Brigade. Its assignment is to take Bory-Notre-Dame. There you can see with the green line. It would mean breaking the Friend-Ravoy line. It's going to do so with 2 battalions, each on a 1,000-yard front, an advance of 6,000 yards. They're not going to have any barrage support, although they do have 5 tanks. But the 5 tanks are all quickly knocked out or break down, so they don't have a major impact on the battle. So to the north is the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, the PPCLI, or the PATS. And the second is the Royal Canadian Regiment, Canada's only regular army battalion at this point in its history. The attack goes in mid-morning, again, without any artillery support, and they're facing the remnants of the 214th Division. There's 2 regiments, the 358th and 50th. Both are gravely reduced in strength. There's some odds and sods, pioneer companies, a Landwehr artillery battalion, but not much in the way of forces. However, moving up is the 141st Regiment, the advance guard of the 35th Division, von Chemnitz's unit. Well, not highly regarded by British intelligence, or at least some of its elements, fight quite well during this battle. So the attack opens up, the PPCLI and the RCR reach Infantry Hill, but because their flanks are open, they're slowed and stopped, and by about noon, they are definitively stopped and are in a bit of trouble. The Pats are down to about 35 men per company, headed by sergeants. The brigade commander, Hugh Daddy Dyer, recognizes there's a problem, and he commits 2 companies of the 49th Battalion and the entire 42nd to cover the flanks of those units. What it means is that he's down to 2 companies in reserve. Meanwhile, the 35th Division is moving into position to counterattack. It issues orders at 3 p.m. in the afternoon for 2-regiment counterattack. Each regiment's going to commit 2 battalions. They are supposed to be supported by 2 artillery regiments. However, the 35th Artillery Regiment, because of communication snafus and having to move into position, doesn't get its orders until the battle's already started. So it does not participate. And the 214th Division's Artillery Regiment is effectively down to 1 battalion without a lot of ammo. The result is this is not a counterattack that's going to be supported by a lot of artillery fire. Meanwhile, sniper patrols from the PATs have penetrated as far as Jigsaw Valley. And you can see that just at the top of your screen. They note the Germans are massing and quickly get word back to headquarters that it's able to mass 7 field artillery brigades and 2 heavy artillery brigades to start pounding the woods. Even the RAF is called in to bomb the woods. So you can see here how signals and communications are so important. The German attack starts around 5 o'clock. They make 5 attempts to try and reach the Canadian line, but are stopped well before they reach the Canadian positions. The attack is a complete failure, and the 61st Battalion, or Regiment, suffers particularly heavy casualties, such that for the rest of the battle, whenever it's attacked, it falls to pieces. It does not put up much of a show. It's been so badly battered by this battle. So why was the German attack a failure? Well, a number of factors. One is timing. If they'd been able to attack at noon, they may have had a much better chance of success. But by doing so 5 to 6 hours later, Canadians had a chance to recover. But the other point I really want to stress is the ability to communicate backwards to bring in the artillery. Unlike what happened with the 2 battalions of the 29th, that the Canadians were able to bring in all of the artillery resources to stop the German advance. Now let's move 4 days forward. We'll take a look at the 30th of August. So the situation is the 1st Brigade has been given the task of taking the southern part of the Fresnes-Rouvroy line and ideally the Vis-en-Artois switch, outlined in this green line. And the plan is the brigade commander, Billy Griesbach, has sent 2 battalions looping through the British sector that are going to strike the Germans from the south, while the 3rd Battalion is going to strike straight east, and that's going to attract the main German attention. All 3 battalions are heavily supported by field artillery, so it's going to be a well-supported attack. Defenders consist of the 121st Regiment of the 26th Reserve Division. This is a crack formation. This is the folks that defended Thiepval for 10 weeks on the Somme so successfully. They're supplemented by 3 battalions from the 4th Ersatz Division, a far less storied formation. The attack opens up 7 minutes before dawn and crushes the German position. The 3rd attracts all of the German attention. They're still able to crack through the Fresnes-Rouvroy line and then strike south. Meanwhile, the 1st and 2nd roll up the German positions. There's a German account where they talk about being overrun, overcome, and taken prisoner. The 3 battalions of the 121st are each reduced to about 50 men each after this particular battle. So it's a great success. Mid-morning, the 1st Brigade is now in its defensive positions. It has 2 battalions forward, 1 in support, 1 in reserve. Everything's fine. Now, some of you may have noticed there's a bit of a problem. There are 2 platoons of the 1st Battalion covering a 2,200-yard front. Will the Germans be able to identify this and take advantage of it? So von Dellmensingen had moved the 16th Division as the intervention division for this sector the day before and had given it the very task it was to carry out on the 30th of August is throw back the attackers. So initially, 2 regiments, the 68th and 28th, were given the task, but then the German High Command identified the vulnerable flank. They sent the 68th to the south and moved up the 29th from reserve, and they were to strike this wide open flank. The attack goes in around noon and is initially quite successful. They roll up the first such that some units actually break and run, and the battalion commander of the 2nd, Little Mac McLaughlin, has to pull out his pistol to rally his troops. The Germans do make some ground, but eventually they're slowed and stopped. They are pounded by artillery, by machine gun fire, and infantry fire. The headquarters group of the 3rd Battalion of the 68th is wiped out by sniper fire. The German attack starts to break down. There's a stalemate. Canadians move up reinforcements. Meanwhile, the Germans are getting pounded. The 2nd Field Artillery Brigade commented that their ammunition wagons were in motion for the entire afternoon, keeping the guns supplied. They were firing so rapidly. So over the rest of the afternoon, late afternoon into the evening, 3 sequential attacks drive back the German positions, and the Canadians restore their line. In the process, the 68th Regiment is badly battered, and we'll see what the impact of that is in 2 days' time. So why did this attack fail? Well, timing-wise, it was well-timed, it was well-positioned. You're hitting an open flank. It should have been successful. But here is a case where Allied and especially the artillery available to the Canadian Corps was sufficient to stop the attack. There were a lot of factors, but it was artillery that was the main factor in slowing and stopping the German advance. So let's look at the 1st of September here. So at this point, the Canadians are close, but they need to get to that green line in order to be within striking distance of the DQ line. The Germans, of course, want to do everything they can to prevent it. So the 3rd and 2nd Brigades are going to attack, and then hopefully, or the expectation is that the 12th Canadian Brigade will be able to advance and occupy a position close to the green line. The defenders consist of the 16th Division. Now, I should have mentioned that this is actually a fairly well-regarded unit in Allied intelligence, and its units have been brought up to strength by other disbanded units, so it is pretty much at full strength, at least at the start of the battle, not so much at this point. It deploys with 2 regiments, 28th to the north, 68th to the south, 29th in reserve. The attack opens up at dawn, and the Germans, especially the 68th, collapses. One of the Canadian reports say they had never seen the Germans so craven. German reports talk of units screaming through the DQ line and staff officers desperately trying to figure out what the heck is going on because the situation had gotten so catastrophic. So certainly the 3rd Brigade has a great deal of success. The 5th Battalion's attack, however, is a lot more difficult. They have a long exposed flank, and the Germans are fighting very fiercely for the switch line. They are able to get into position, but they've used up a lot of their ammunition. They're tired. They are vulnerable to a counterattack. While this is going on, the 12th Brigade pushes its battalions forward. So Delmensinger is not going to accept that the Canadians are on the jump-off positions. They must be driven back. So he orders the 29th Regiment to counterattack. And they have no success on the front of the 3rd Brigade, but they hit the 5th when it's vulnerable. Again, this is a case where the attackers at their weakest, the attack is well-timed, and it rolls back the attackers. However, somewhat surprisingly, the 5th Battalion, with only a platoon from the 72nd Battalion as an additional force, is able to recoil, reload, and then counterattack on its own and drive the Germans back. Again, the German units flow through the DQ line as they are fleeing the Canadian position. Here's a case where this was just raw infantry firepower coming into action. The 5th did this without any artillery support, so it was just good, hard infantry fighting that was able to defeat this counterattack. Well, Delmensinger is not finished yet. He is absolutely determined to drive back the Canadians, so he decides to commit his Eingreif Division for this sector, the 3rd Reserve Division, and he sends in the 34th Fusilier and the 49th Reserve Regiments. Third Reserve is not a great unit, but it's kind of an average formation. They advanced around 6 o'clock. They crossed the DQ line without any difficulty, but once they're spotted by Canadian forward forces, they're able to bring in the artillery, and these two battalions suffered very heavy losses and disorganization. When the Canadians attack the next morning, both will fold when they are attacked. So why was this attack not successful? Timing was terrible, but also, again, artillery power was just too great to overcome. Now, let's take a look at the failure factors. Now, one of the challenges of looking at this particular battle is that it's often difficult to reconcile the very different accounts on the German side, the British and Canadian side as to what's going on. Both sides talk about counterattacks made and received, which don't show up in the records of the other side. There are, however, 12 cases where the attacks are well attested and that we can actually do some analysis on. So what I've done is summarize them in this table, where you've got the date, the German units involved, how many battalions, the classification of the unit, whether it's average, elite, or weak, its state, whether fresh, exhausted, or tired, the defenders, and the outcome. Now, the 4 case studies that we looked at for the DQ line I've outlined in red. Now, what you should notice from all of this is that there are 3 successes out of the 12, and they are all small-scale operations. There are 3 outright failures, which result in heavy casualties to the Germans, and there are 6 initial successes where the Germans were able to gain some ground, but eventually were driven back, and in almost every one of these instances suffered very heavy losses in the process that gravely weakened them for when the Canadians attacked at a subsequent point. So only 1/4 of the attacks were a success, 3/4 were ultimately a failure. So not a very good record. So why was this? Well, first, it's an issue of timing. In at least 2 of the cases that we looked at, the timing was way off. There was no chance that they were going to be successful. Because if you wait too long, the defenders recover. They can consolidate, they can get more ammunition, and really critically, the signals are restored. And this is a theme we'll see throughout this particular section. Next is increased infantry effectiveness. The Canadian Corps had a unique advantage in that it was out of the line for 2 months, where it was able to conduct sophisticated all-arms training. This is up to brigade-level maneuvers, including infantry, cavalry, artillery, machine guns, aircraft, engineers, medical, supplies, the entire gamut of forces, so that the Canadians had gained a great deal of experience and confidence in open warfare tactics. What's more is the troops did a lot of physical activity and training so that they were in excellent shape and could handle, in some cases, 27 hours of straight fighting and still be effective at the end of it. What's more is the Canadian Corps missed the German spring offensives. As a result, when they arrived at Arras, they were at full strength, and at Amiens, they were at full strength. At Arras, almost every battalion was at full strength. So this had the benefit that the Canadians had not undergone that soul-destroying process of having to rebuild division after division. Now, use this as a contrast. The 51st Division, which served with the Canadians, was on its 3rd rebuild in 1918. When it arrived on the Arras sector, it was only able to conduct individual training, that is, musketry and drill. They were not able to do platoon, company, battalion, or even brigade maneuvers, whereas the Canadians were. This contributes to another important factor of improved leadership. Because the Canadians had this opportunity for the advanced training and the low levels of casualties, they had a quite experienced leadership cadre. So I'll give you an example of this. The 16th Battalion, when it entered Amiens, had all of its platoon commanders with a minimum of 8 months service as a platoon commander in the battalion. And that includes 2 months of open warfare training. I very much doubt that there were many, if any, in the 51st Division that had even 8 weeks of experience in the division. And the final point is confidence. Canadians had a great deal of confidence going into 1918 after the great successes that they'd enjoyed during the 1917 offensives. Amiens just increased it even that much more. I mean, you can read in accounts and letters at the time of soldiers commenting, we were used to advances of hundreds of yards and hundreds of prisoners. Now we're advancing thousands of yards and taking thousands of prisoners. So Canadian infantry was going into Arras relatively fresh. They had strong leadership, were well trained, and capable of handling just about anything the Germans could throw at them. We also had increased infantry firepower. During the spring of 1918, every platoon within the British Expeditionary Force, including the Canadians, received a second Lewis gun per platoon. The result was it greatly increased the firepower available to the platoon commander, and it had another benefit in that more of these vital weapons would survive an attack and be available to repel a counterattack. And they were crucial to the success of both the attack and the defense. And I'm going to leave it to Billy Griesbach to summarize this at the end. He said, we may attribute our success to it, referring to the Lewis gun, and the men who handle it. And this was a common theme running through Canadian after-action reports of the absolute centrality of the Lewis gun to infantry success in attack and defense. Not only was the infantry fighting at a higher level, so was the artillery. In 3 of the 4 cases, the artillery was clearly the devastating factor in the success of the Canadian success in repelling German attacks. Why was that? Well, there have been some important advances over 1917. First is predicted fire. So in the past, if there had been a major advance, the gunners would take time to have to register their pieces before they could intervene. Now, with the ability to do predictive fire, they could advance, and say in the case of the 26th of August, 6,000 yards and still be able to fire relatively accurate counter barrages to help their infantry. Further, because of this open warfare training, it was far easier to supply these forces. They had the experience of the open warfare conditions and being able to get rounds up to the guns at the front. The guns themselves had improved the mobility. The gunners did a lot of practicing of moving in the open during the open warfare training, and so we're able to shake off some of the old habits from trench warfare. And the final point is signals. By no means perfect, and there were still a lot of challenges, but it was far better than in 1917 and be able to get information from the front to the rear to the gunners so they knew how to intervene. And I want to talk about that. Just as a matter of interest, this is a picture of the Canadian Brigade headquarters. You can see the wired communications come in off unfortunately off this particular picture is an aerial for a continuous wave radio. You can see dispatch riders ready to be sent out to the various units. So over 1918, the Canadians had greatly improved their signal capacity. In one respect, they had an advantage over most British formations in that they had a priority in receiving what are called continuous wave sets. This was the iPhone of the period. It had greater range, greater clarity, greater or less interference from other sets. And the Second Army was complaining the Canadians were getting 80% of these sets that were coming to the Western Front because there just weren't enough. As another data point, when the Canadians moved to the Arras, back to the Arras sector, they replaced the 17th Corps. The Canadians had to turn off all of their CW sets because the 17th Corps at that point had 3 divisions, did not have a single CW set in the Corps. What's more is the Canadians had more signalers. In the spring of 1918, Currie, the commander of the Canadian Corps, was able to convince GHQ to allow some major changes to the Canadian organization. Canadians retained the 4-battalion brigade. They were able to add an engineer brigade to each division. They added more machine gunners, more guns, more trucks. Just about every category, there was more being added. The one thing GHQ did not allow was a request for additional signalers. And the Signal Corps had trouble just keeping communications open in trench warfare conditions. In open warfare situations, it was going to be even worse. So what does Currie do? He just adds the 1,000 extra signalers anyways. Canadians had the advantage that they had sufficient manpower that they could do this. And finally, the open warfare training was really important in helping the Signal Corps prepare for the conditions that they would face in that open warfare environment. It improved their mobility and allowed them to practice things that they typically didn't get a lot of chance of doing, things like visual communications. And I'll give you an example of this. On the 1st of September, the 15th Battalion, within an hour of the opening of the attack, was able to communicate visually back to headquarters to call an artillery fire on nearby machine gun posts to suppress them. This would have taken hours in 1917. It could be done in minutes in 1918, thanks to the improved signals. It wasn't only that the Canadians and the British had improved, the Germans had decreased in quality and quantity. And I want to talk first about infantry. Now, the Germans were weaker than they were in 1917, no question about it. But we have to be careful about numbers, because in my analysis of these, or detailed analysis of the German situation, there's enormous discrepancies in unit strengths between various units. So you have a unit like the 91st Reserve Regiment that has a combat strength of 225 men. But then you have the 2nd Grenadier Regiment that has 10 times that number of men. In all of the case studies that I talked about, the units involved were all at or close to full strength, albeit somewhat weaker than they would have been in 1917, but they have also been greatly supplemented with additional machine guns and trench mortars. One area that I have not seen in the analysis that I did was morale in an attack. The Germans pressed their attacks, perhaps maybe not as strongly as they did in 1917, but there were certainly no cases where the attacks failed because of morale issues. Where morale did have an impact was when the Canadians attacked. The basic rule is if you had a strong enough artillery barrage, the German infantry would collapse. Where there was issues was in training. So even those units that were at full strength were complaining that they had not had a chance to train to be able to build a cohesive force. As a result, these were units of strangers that were not used to fighting with each other. Further, the German doctrine relied heavily on junior leadership of junior officers and senior NCOs. And increasingly, and this is a complaint that you see over and over again in the German accounts, is that leaders are getting selected because of courage or valor as opposed to leadership ability. Further, there was not the time to train them. And because the system was so sophisticated, the result was the infantry was turning into a little bit more than a militia and unable to maneuver effectively under the weight of Allied firepower. German artillery was weaker as well. The Germans had severe shell shortages. So the 2nd German Army, deployed to the south of the Canadian position, was firing 50,000 rounds a day during this period. The Canadian Corps during 2nd Arras was firing 95,000 rounds a day. So you can see an enormous discrepancy. Further, the German decision to move their field artillery back out of range of the enemy counter-battery fire meant they were less able to intervene when it came to counterattacks. Further, about 20 to 25% of the German field artillery was deployed in forward zones as anti-tank guns, where they performed very well in stopping the Allied tank attacks. However, it meant that they were unable to contribute to the barrages for counterattacks. So in conclusion, the centerpiece of the German doctrine was the counterattack. If the counterattacks did not work, the German doctrine did not work. The results of the counterattacks during Second Arras were about a 75% failure rate and a 25% success rate. But those 25% were all small-scale operations that really had no impact on the battle. Where the results were absolutely necessary, the attack either outright failed or was initially successful, but eventually defeated. And as a result, the Germans kept being pushed back. Why? First, Eugene, timing. If you don't attack at the right time and the attacker or defender is set, your attack's not going to succeed. Canadians were more effective than they were in 1917, and the Germans were less effective than 1917. So this concludes the presentation, and we'll open it up for questions and answers.
Bill, that was tremendous. Thanks ever so much indeed. Thoroughly enjoyed that. Deep in the other side of the wire to a certain extent. So that was excellent indeed. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you'd care to show your appreciation in the now time-honoured way of raising your hands on the old Zoom software there, I can tell Bill that we've got a virtual with literally hundreds of hands being raised as a silent round of applause. So,
thank you. Thank you.
Time. So, let me just. I'm just going to, and we'll just go into questions. And I know we've got some already. So, thanks to everybody who's asked a question. So, let's just go to Richard Owen.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Bill, for a wonderful lecture. My question is, I noticed from your spreadsheet that the German battalions were, like the 65th was considered strong, and the sort of 700th was considered weaker. That followed the practice in the World War II, I believe, you know, at the time of D-Day. Was that considered the way it was done in the First World War, that the weaker battalions were higher numbers?
Yes, well, it varied a lot, because you would have some units that would be a reserve division that normally you would think would be not as much of a crack formation. In other cases, you have high-numbered regiments that were composed of, divisions that would be composed from regiments taken from a regular army division. And so during 1915-16, the Germans went from a 4-regiment division to a 3-regiment. So in some cases, they pulled crack formations out and added them together. So you might have a high number, but it could be a very good division. But generally speaking, Allied intelligence regarded Bavarian formations as being quite strong. Typically, they are rated quite highly. Pure Prussian units are regarded well, unless they've got a lot of Alsatians or Poles, in which case they're not regarded very well. Württemberg formations are kind of unique, that the Germans had a very different approach to officership. They had very low numbers of officers in their battalions. Like a Canadian battalion nominally is supposed to have 48 officers by 1918. A German battalion at full strength would have 23. If they had 12, they would be lucky. So, whereas the Württembergers actually had equivalent numbers to British battalions. And as a result, they tended to perform better than you would have expected. So it's often as much where the unit is from. Saxons had the reputation for being okay on defense, but you never had to worry about them in an offensive situation.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks for that. Thanks for your question there, Richard. Andrew Locke. Andrew, do you just want to unmute yourself there?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Bill. That was really good. They're all sites that I sort of know quite well, but very much from a 1917 perspective more than a 1918 one. So my question was, given the relative success that the British and Second Army really had in September 1917 in their kind of bite and hold style of defeating German counterattacks when they came, did the Germans modify their style of counterattacking, or because it seems a little bit predictable from the British point of view? You sort of know that they're coming. by this stage.
Yeah, and certainly during Passchendaele, the whole offense that there was a dialogue going on, is the British would adopt a new policy, the Germans would try to react. So at some points during Passchendaele, the Germans are actually strengthened the forward zone, put more forces in there in the hope of stopping the Germans. And all it did was result in a lot of dead Germans. So in a sense, if the British are happy with just taking that forward zone, there's not much the Germans can do. And they got these pre-planned attacks that they're going to race in. Their expectation is that, in essence, it's like the analogy I used of running into the ocean, that they're hoping the Allies are going to race beyond that point of equilibrium where they're vulnerable to the counterattack. Certainly, like, for instance, the Canadians at Hill 70 in 1917, the whole attack was predicated on forcing the Germans to counterattack a key position. So it was a relatively shallow advance. They had pre-planned artillery in place, machine gun barrages, the whole gamut. So the Germans just smashed their way against these forces. So yes, there was a real risk that if the Allies were willing to take small bites, there's not a lot the Germans could do. They were facing enormous material discrepancies, and they're in essence trying to find tactical palliatives for operational and strategic problems.
Thank you.
Ian Ferrance.
Yes, thank you, Bill. That was a fascinating talk. I'm wondering how much the phenomenon of voluntary capture by low morale German units, whether that was really a thing by Second Arras and contributed to the failure of the counteroffensives, or whether that was more of an autumn phenomenon.
Great question. And it wasn't in the counterattacks that this emerged. It was when the Canadians attacked. So there are cases of a signal detachment of 3 capturing 60 Germans that were hiding in dugouts. So what would happen is the German regiment at full strength, pretty good morale, would be thrown fruitlessly against the Canadian formation, suffer heavy casualties, and be in pretty sad shape. And when the Canadians then attacked the next day or 2 days later, a lot of the troops would go and hide. Like, there's one of the German regimental accounts that captures it really excellently, is that there were 12 men caught in a dugout, and only 2 of them were willing to try and escape. The rest of them had just decided, I'm going to surrender. And so there's a lot of evidence to support Alexander Watson's statement that when there were dugouts, the Germans would hide in there because it was a good way of waiting for the barrage and the initial wave of troops to pass through, and then they could surrender safely. Because there was always that risk that in the heat of the moment, especially when you're dealing with Canadians, they don't tend to take a lot of prisoners if you don't surrender immediately.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question there, Ian. That's great. Okay, next. Dwight Mercer asked, in addition to identified weaknesses of the Germans, what role did influenza and calories in their diet have?
Well, certainly there were reports that there was something like 1 million Germans that were on the sick list in the summer of 1918. And I listened to a couple presentations where they talked about that the German records, in a lot of cases, there were troops that were sick that were held at the unit level and not actually entered into the medical system, but they weren't capable of fighting. Where I think the numbers really come into play is when there are Canadian attacks that the German units were very much weakened, especially after these counterattacks, that they're not able to generate much in the way of firepower.
Thanks for that. Mark.
Hello, Bill. Great presentation. Thank you. I'm from the other coast of Canada, so it's nice to hear a Canuck.
Oh, right. Go Canucks.
Very quickly. It seems to be in a lot of this is almost a unique Canadian experience. And, to put on your, oracle for a second, do you think the experience would have been same, let's say, with the French army or British units in the opposition? And what the outcome would have been?
Well, I'm not as prepared to speak about the French because I think they have very different kind of circumstances, and I don't know enough. I haven't done, sort of the deep archival evidence. On the British side, when you see the number of disadvantages the British were operating under, it's actually kind of amazing how well they actually did. So I'll use the 51st as an example. It was on its third rebuild. Its battalions are very weak. They don't have much in the way of training. The British official history speaks that basically the tactical organization was find a few officers that are actually tactically capable and put their units under it and hope the artillery is going to take you through to the objective. Now, certainly, there are certain British units that were in far better shape than other units, but there was the factor that I've seen is like the 4th British Division, it was not able to retain its combat power anywhere to the same extent as the Canadian divisions. That they fell off much more quickly. And in part, the Canadian divisions are 50% larger than the British units. So it's not at all surprising, and it's not, trying to take a shot at the British. Given the level of training and the resources, they were doing amazingly well given the circumstances. But certainly the ability for a Canadian division to keep attacking for 3 straight days is something that a lot of British formations would just not be able to do.
Thanks for that. Thanks for the question. Right. Robert Linnell.
Hey, Robert.
Hello, Bill. Great talk. Question about German defenses. I know that particularly in 17, they used a lot of mustard gas, as they found it very effective as a defensive, tool, as it were. How much were they using that still in Arras, did you find? Because you didn't really mention gas on either side, and Curry, of course, loved to use gas.
They used a lot of gas, in part because some of the German regimental histories are referring to they didn't have anything other than gas shells to use. But what they were doing was there's a lot of river valleys that this battle zone was you fought your way through. So the Germans would flood these with mustard gas and other forms of gas, and because they knew that the Canadians moving up would have to move through these areas, and it was not that it caused a lot of casualties, but it did mean it was just a lot more of a hassle for everyone because they had to wear their masks. There was a case of 1 battalion before the attack on the 2nd of August had not had a hot meal in 2 days because the gas was so prevalent. So the Germans were using a fair amount of it. It was more of a nuisance than actually as a powerful effect. Although there was one instance where prior to the start of the battle, the Germans basically knocked out a Canadian company thanks to mustard gas, that they had shelled the battalion or the company all through the night. And the gas sergeant, the one responsible for giving the all clear, gave the all clear in the morning, not realizing that the morning sun was going to vaporize the gas. And as a result, the company was reduced to about 50 men. Now, not a lot were killed, but a lot were made very ill as a result.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question there, Robert. Thank you. Glenn Taylor, do you want to just unmute yourself there, Glenn?
Yeah, okay, thanks, David. First, Bill, thanks for an excellent presentation. I think the more we understand about German defensive tactics in 1917 and in 1918, the more we'll understand about those 2 years of the war. My question relates a little bit like Ian. It relates back to 1917, where the Canadians had huge success at the Hill 70 operation in August 1917, and also at Passchendaele as well in their efforts to defeat the counterattacks. And they never actually took a step back in either of those 2 operations. So how much did that contribute, do you feel, to their success in 1918?
What I found interesting is that the 1917 and 1918, it's a completely different war. So you take a look at the distances advanced, the density of forces, the amount of artillery support, all through 1918, it's basically the density is 1/3 of Passchendaele. The distances are 10 times greater. The tempo is measured in hours as opposed to days. So during Passchendaele, Canadian attacks, there was a gap of 4 days to 7 days for a multi-divisional attack. In this situation, the Canadians are attacking on every day but one. And so there's an entirely different tempo. So while 1918 is characterized by very careful short steps where you're within the protected cover of the field artillery, in 1918, you're advancing far beyond the field artillery barrage, and you're having to fight your way forward using your own infantry weapons. And there were times when the Canadians ran into problems, such as beyond the DQ line on the 2nd of September, because they didn't have their artillery support, and the Germans had so many machine guns in position, they could not advance in the face of that much firepower.
Okay, but I'll just add one interesting point about your wave analogy there. Because I used to serve in the British forces in the 1980s, the German army then, in defending against the Russians, they had a phrase called Schwammverteidigung that meant sponge defense. It's exactly the same philosophy as 1918.
Yeah, it's the same kind of idea, is that it's interesting to see is that in 1916, the first half of the Somme, it's a rigid defense. You're never going to move. You're going to stay where you stand until you die. You can never fall back. And what they found is that all it did was open the forward forces to getting pounded by artillery. So the whole idea of this is that where's the attacker the strongest? Well, the closer you are to the front. The deeper you go, the weaker the attacker is. And if you have to deepen the artillery barrage and artillery support, that means there's less shells overall. So it means the more defenders survive and are more able to resist the enemy. But what it does mean is that you have to have fairly sophisticated tactics, that troops just don't automatically fall back on every attack. And I read a couple accounts, thanks to Robert Linnell, who was kind enough to give me some of these documents, of complaints from senior German officers that by Arras, the German units are using elastic defense to fall back. Like, they just did not expect that they would ever be able to hold the line. And that when given orders to, you must defend this to the end, they didn't believe it, and they would just fall back in front of an attack.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks for your question there, Glenn. Angela, do you want to just ask your question now? Just unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you for the talk. It was great. I just wondered what the rate of desertion and other offences from the Canadian Expeditionary Force at this point was, and how were these offences dealt with?
Well, they were dealt with primarily the same way as the British Army dealt with things, that there wasn't a lot of mercy being shown. Desertion was a much greater issue in Canada. So at this point, Canada had imposed conscription. And so a lot of people that were conscripted were brought in, and they decided that they didn't really want to go overseas. So there was a lot of issues with that. Desertion within England was less of an issue. Overall criminality, well, not as bad as the Australians, was certainly worse than the British. What I've seen is Canadian crime rates were about double of what the British units were. And certainly in looking at things like training and so forth, British Inspector Generals would say, you know, the Canadians were better at some activities, but anything that required discipline, not so good at. Less capable than British formations.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much for your question, Adam. Michael Phipps. Michael, do you want to unmute yourself there?
Hi, Bill. That was a fantastic presentation. Great use of the graphics, and it's lovely to see the maps to follow it. So you've inspired me to buy one of your books, I think. You mentioned in the overview of the push to Cambrai that the infantry really outran the range of the artillery. And I just wondered what the plan was, what was the process if there was one, for moving up the batteries or the individual guns to try and follow and get that range? Were they into pre-planned positions, assuming they'd captured the pre-planned positions? How did that work?
They didn't go that far, but that's actually a really interesting question because there's a couple different dimensions to it. So typically what the Canadians were doing is that they would assign a field artillery brigade, like after the barrage was fired, they assign a field artillery brigade to either a division or a infantry brigade, and then they would break up the batteries to the individual battalions, and they would move forward with them as they advanced. And then typically there would be engineering resources assigned to the artillery to help them move forward. Because this ground was just so seamed with trenches, it was not like Amiens where they could just go across, go cross country. They had to stick to roads, or they had to fill in the trenches to get the guns to move up. But essentially, the idea was that once you ran outside of the barrage, you would assign individual field guns to a battalion or maybe a section to the guns, and they would move forward. Generally speaking, it was not a success. The artillery complained that the infantry had no idea about artillery targets. A section commander could either be at the battalion headquarters or with the guns, but it couldn't be in both places. And that often there was miscommunication. So I'd say less than half the time the artillery section would marry up with its appropriate infantry battalion. There were certainly times it could be very useful, but the fundamental problem is that because the Germans are conducting this spread out defense, you needed a barrage to suppress the area. So individual guns or a section could certainly suppress a particular target. But when you've got a whole field filled with machine gun nests, they're not going to be successful. And that was what was the crucial problem in the battle.
That's a good question there, Michael. Everett Fryman, Everett, do you want to just unmute yourself there?
Right. Dr. Stewart, thank you for the wonderful presentation. My question is about the effectiveness of German anti-tank weapons, in particular in the Battle of 30 August. It's to my understanding that each German infantry company had 2 model Mauser 1918s, better known as Tigewehr, in Company MTO. I was wondering if it was the Tigewehr effective on the Battle of 30 August in any way during the scope of the time there, Dr. Stewart?
Yeah. Okay, well, a couple different dimensions to this. The Canadians were actually only supported by tanks on the 26th, 27th, and 2nd of September. There were no tanks on the 30th. Although, if you read German accounts, there are tanks everywhere. There are tanks coming out of the water, flying from the sky when there weren't any. Generally speaking, what was the tank killers were artillery and trench mortars. So German trench mortars could do direct fire, and they had a lot of them. They were far more effective than the British Stokes mortar. Even though they were heavier and more awkward to maneuver, the Germans devoted resources to making them mobile. And as a result, they could have a devastating effect. Generally speaking, if you massed tanks like you did on the 2nd of September, they could be successful. Typically, they were used in small quantities and easily picked off by German field artillery. They were generally not particularly successful with the Canadian Corps, in part because the Canadians didn't know how to use the tanks properly. They had not had much experience with them. Just as another point, there's a recent release book from a French author talking about the French development in 1918. They were talking about their tank force. And if I recall correctly, the number was 3 to 4% of the tanks lost during the 100 days were lost to infantry weapons. Everything else was either breakdowns or artillery, trench mortars, kind of direct fire weapons.
Thank you, Dr. Stewart.
Thanks very much. Thanks for your question there, Everett. Matt, the last question from Mark Smith. Mark says, fascinating to hear the Canadians had 2 months of open warfare training. Where and how did the Canadian troops feel about all this extra training?
They loved it. This was the only opportunity they had to get away from the wartime conditions. the Canadian commanders were clever enough that the first month was intense training. And then what they did is they scaled it back. So the mornings were devoted to training, afternoons to sporting activities. So you can read a lot of different accounts from the Canadians at the time talking about it was glorious to be in the summer around grass, around things with not being shelled, where there were civilians. And they understood the value of this training. They had never had such a prolonged period of sustained training. And the result was that they gained even more confidence, and they could see how this training was going on. And the Canadians actually, there's a lot of similarities to what the Germans were doing prior to their spring offensives. There was a lot of looking at the sort of the German training. In fact, some of the training manuals the Canadians used were based on German documents. So
very much.
Good question. The Canadians loved it. Not getting shot at is always an advantage. And the
whereabouts was it?
We've got.
Oh, sorry.
We can hear you now. We can hear you, Mark.
Hi, Bill. Thank you for answering that question. Whereabouts did it actually? Where did they actually do this training?
They were positioned behind the First Army, behind Vimy, in the area. There was a couple training areas. They were initially being trained to participate in something that was called Operation Delta, which was an attack on the boundary between the First and Second Army in Flanders. And it turns out that Operation Delta was an almost perfect analog for Amiens. Canadians would be moved in the night before the attack. There was a predicted fire or artillery barrage. There were tank support. So the Canadians did intensive training and the expectation that they would be committed to this. Haig decided not to pull this off because he was concerned that what the Germans were doing, because they were still conducting offensives against the French. He wanted to keep the Canadians, because they were by far the strongest formations on the Western Front at this point, clear so that he could commit them if the Germans ever decided to attack. He was very concerned. There were numerous references in his diary about Germans massing in front of Arras. It was a very sensitive spot to him.
Oh, but beautiful. I'll tell you what, you Canadian people are wonderful people. From my experience in Kandahar, I work with you on operations, and you're wonderful people. And believe me,
oh, thanks.
Pat
Wonderful to hear.
You're a great country. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for helping the Anglo-Canadian alliance there. Right. That was going to be the last question, but it's not the last question now, because just right at the 11th hour, indeed the 12th hour, Campbell, over to you.
Oh, we snuck one in. Thanks, Mark, for that comment about Canadians. Much appreciated. Bill, thank you for an outstanding lecture. That was just tremendous. On Monday, we had Paul Knight give us a presentation on, he called it Lessons from the Mud. It was the 55th West Lancashire Division, and they were talking about the Third Ypres, Battle of Third Ypres. And they were talking about all the problems that they had. And one of them that came up quite a bit was ammunition resupply. The infantry would get so far ahead that they'd run out of bullets and they couldn't get the bullets up to them, right? Or the artillery, for that matter. So I'm wondering, in Arras, with mobile warfare, was this still an issue? Had they resolved that, or
well, it's never going to be solved. The more ammunition you have, the more gets fired. So it's always going to be an issue. But because of the nature of the operation, typically there wasn't as much shooting or fighting going on. You're going deeper, so they're tending to arrive at their final position in better shape than they had in the past. And in contrast to Third Ypres, there's not the mud and the mess to try and get stuff to move forward. So it's much easier to resupply. However, the Canadian attack did start to stumble in the midpoint of the offensive. This sector, the Canadians attacked, is not well served by rail. So the Canadians had to get the resupply head was on the other side of Arras, about 15 kilometers away. So they were at the very edge of the logistics envelope. But what they did have as a secret weapon is tramways. So the Canadians were allowed to run their own rail system, basically, light rail system. No other corps was allowed to do this, but because the Canadians had the resources to do it. So they were able to drive their light rail close to the front. So about 1,800 tons a day were delivered through the tramways to the front. And that was the difference between the offensive either slowing down and stopping like it did at the Somme and being able to do operations every day but one.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for your question there. That's it. Ladies and gentlemen, I thoroughly enjoyed that, and I believe everybody who has been on board has enjoyed that. So in the time on way, applause please for Bill for his presentation. And the hands are indeed, as before, going up in a silent virtual round of applause there, Bill. So thanks for that.
All right.
That was, and particularly the whole talk was excellent, but your grasp of the Q&A session was tremendous there. That was an excellent Q&A session, and we've actually got through all the questions, which is very rare for us to be able to get through.
So either I scared people off, or there just wasn't it wasn't that interesting of a presentation. Really good questions. Really good questions.
They were really good questions, but I don't think you scared anybody off. That was really tremendous. I thoroughly enjoyed the talk, but just the dynamics of the Q&A session went very.
Yeah, I always enjoy that part, because that's where there's all that information that you've read that you couldn't put into the presentation that you can bring out and highlight various dimensions to it. So most interesting. Absolutely.
Bill, many thanks indeed for the presentation. We had right at the beginning were not an issue at all, so that went very well. I suspect I'm still stuttering and buffering here, so I'll not rattle on any further, and say on behalf of everybody here, thanks very much indeed. Thank you very much, Bill.
Well, thank you, and I'd certainly be happy to do another one in the future, because I enjoy doing these. So
that's excellent to know. A volunteer is better than any number of pressed men. So thanks.
Okay.
Thanks for that.
All right. Take care. Thank you.
Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, she hasn't been kissed for 40 years. Hinky, pinky, parlez-vous. Out talking.